All right, we get started. Okay, we're going to get started now on our tonight lesson here. We're going to try that at 7. So we got our recording going, so we're going to pray and get started on our session for Daniel. We'll continue this study, so let's pray. Father, be with us and ask you to be with us now to study your word and help rely on you, trust in you, and just ask you to help calm our hearts and protect us from this interference of the world around us and our own sinful flesh and things that pull at us. Help us to see you, help us to rely on you, and help us just to really think about how we're just so grateful for who you are in our life and how you've given us so much. Help us to see things in your word that we can just not learn from you, but just also seek ways to how it can apply to our life, relationships, interactions with our daily life. Help me to be calm in my frustrations and give me the compassion of wisdom when showing that through patience, and help us to all see this wonderful lesson in the life of Daniel, how you've exhibited your wisdom and your trustworthiness in him, and how he made such a great example and testimony of a light shining in darkness in this time of this world where his entire peoples were taken away and his land taken away, and yet he did not let that dismay him. He put more trust and more faith and just so much absolute steadfastness with you. Help us to be likewise for the days out ahead, the days that we live in now, and help us be an example that testifies of you and your light and your love and your truth. And we ask that you be our pastor, our teacher, our guide in this time, our coming bridegroom. And we ask that you watch over the words of my mouth, meditations of my heart, and your words be acceptable in your sight, for you are our rock and our redeemer and our strength and our shield. We ask all this in Jesus, Yeshua's name we pray. Amen. So, hello from the car. Hello from, you're so funny. All right, so everybody, hello from different places, car, office, home, right? So we're going to be tonight going through Daniel and doing some reflections on chapter 2 in reference to what we've already talked about and studied and learned from Daniel, and talk about a little bit of chapter 3 as well leading into that, and then we'll continue chapter 3 on Sunday. So the things in so far we looked at is that Daniel was a young man, and some of the reflections thus far we know about that people tend to miss is that, first off, Daniel was a young man about the age of 13. How do we know that? Because it says there were Yeleds, or children. And the children, the word Yeled for the Hebrew is commensurate with that teknon Greek transliteration, which means from like 13 to 19. So he's somewhere in that range. I tend to think he's on the younger side of things at 13 years of age. We do know also from chapter 2, he's 16 when that chapter opens up. When chapter 3 opens up, you won't know it unless you read the Septuagint, but you'll find out by doing the math. He's actually 22 at that point. So he goes off from chapter 1 as an overview of his experience at the young age, going into his 3 years of training that was required from Nebuchadnezzar unto Ashpenaz to give unto the princes and nobles he brought in from the peoples he conquered. Then we also know that in chapter 2, it's a reflection on the end of chapter 1 what had happened. Then he was 16 at that point, and how Nebuchadnezzar interacted with him and exalted him to this chief station, and also his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So we know from there, then chapter 3 is, we're going to get to that a little bit later, but it's in the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar, so he's 6 years later, and now we're looking at he's 22 years of age, so there's a gap there of time, and we don't know much of what was recorded in there because it wasn't told to us. We just know you have to understand 6 years of time had gone by the end of the events of chapter 2 and the beginning of the events of chapter 3. And that plays a huge part in some of these questions people always ask about, where's Daniel? Where's Daniel? Where's Daniel? Why come he's not in the fiery furnace? There was a 6-year time gap that you do not pick up on in the King James, but if you read your Septuagint, it starts off and tells you about the time frame of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and that gives you a good clue of some understanding and backdrop as to why and how he might not have been there, because he wasn't in that region at that time. And we'll get involved in that a little bit later as well. So going back to chapter 2 and some of the takeaways we saw, I was summarizing on the board, is that Nebuchadnezzar had this real, of course, terrifying dream. He had a restless night. He woke up sleeping and restless, agitated. He asked his people, his magicians, his astrologers, his sorcerers, his soothsayers, his Chaldeans, 3 times. And they all 3 times just kind of like, just trying to bide their time. And he got sick of it. And he's like, enough. Their job is to come when they're called and to answer when they're asked. That's their sole job. And they didn't do it. And so then we find that he just gets furious and angry and puts a decree out to kill all the wise men, right? And we saw that he did that. And the last response that the people gave the Chaldeans on behalf of all the other Yahoos was, none of the gods can answer this question. And that's the takeaway. I want to stop in that moment and go back and realize what they did. If you remember what they did, going back to chapter 2, let's look at the 3 things, how they dealt with conflict versus the ways that Daniel dealt with this conflict. And their conflict was the king was sleepless night and was agitated. How did they deal with a king who was pure authority, who has agitated in his spirit, and he's restless and he's edgy? How they deal with that conflict? A person who is visibly, audibly disturbed and has the ability to whip your butt. How do you deal with that? So don't give me this garbage. Well, that conflict, that same as my conflict. This is pretty severe conflict when it comes to the fact you're a subordinate. The person in authority is irritated, and it's clearly agitated in every single way, not just frame of mind, but outwardly manifested. And they're demanding of you answers, and they want them now. How do you deal with that conflict? And so the conflict of being in a subordinate role and having somebody who has the power and authority to end your life, and that's not a joke, that's what he was doing, right? It's like, hey, I want the answer. So we find in the first chapter, second chapter, excuse me, the first thing they did, as you remember, is they appeal to him. And the first thing that you see them, they say into verse 4, O king, live forever, and tell your servants your dream, right? So they're trying to appeal to the ego. That's the first thing that they do. Next thing they do is they deny and they deflect by saying, can you tell us again? The second time he asked them, and he knows they're trying to buy time in verse 7 and 8. They're trying to buy time, and he calls them out on that. Then the third thing they do is they show their hypocrisy by claiming they can't do what they said all along they could do. You said you talked to gods, plural. But now you don't hear from these gods? And yet you have the audacity to tell me, as they told Nebuchadnezzar in verse 10 and 11, that no one could ask this thing, but in verse 11, it's a rare thing, king, you require, and none other than no one can show it before the God except to the king, except for the gods who dwell not with flesh. But I thought you were in touch with these gods. I thought you were always, poking your chest out when you could hear from the gods and tell us what the gods had to say. But now when push comes to shove, when you have nothing to lie about because you have no beginning, no genesis of any story, I want you to tell me what I dreamt, because now I'm calling you out. I'm exposing the hypocrisy of your charlatan ways. The emperor's got no clothes, right? So those are the 3 ways the conflict was dealt with by human sinfulness. 1, we appeal to ego. That's what people do when they're in their flesh, when you're in the human mindset. You appeal to someone's ego. You say, you know what? When someone's in authority over you, when someone has the power to make your life a little miserable, your boss, a police officer, right? A judge, a lawyer, right? You tend to want to appeal to their ego. Flatter them a little bit. Oh, king, live forever. Yeah, right, sure, yeah, okay. So they appeal to the ego. The second thing they did, they deflect and denied. Oh, tell us again. If you tell us, we can do it. You answer the question. The question is no. You don't ask questions. You answer questions. Their job's to answer, not ask. Well, could you give us the dream? No, that wasn't the question. The question is, you tell me what I dreamt and what it means. And they were like, that's not how that works. So with that being said, it was just really interesting how you find that this is where all of a sudden, okay, well, now they get to the third thing where, again, they claim the inability to do what they've been claiming they represent. They're supposed to represent, they said they claim to talk to gods, yet they don't know the answer. This is like people, for example, who say, I walk humbly before God, and then they can't do a simple thing, being humble to someone else and showing God's love by applying wisdom with compassion, which is showing it through patience. So someone wrongs you and they talk to you wrong, that they do you wrong, and you go, I have no time for this! Excuse me? I was in a situation today, I was very agitated and very livid and very frustrated. We went to a doctor's office today for a 9:30 appointment. We got there at 9:15. They didn't even call us back to the room until 10 o'clock. And then, back in the room, waited another half an hour before he walks in. I was like, excuse me? We waited 45 minutes in the waiting room and another half an hour in the room back in the back. Was I irritated? Yes. Was I mad? Yes. Very livid. Like, come on, come on. And of that day today, of all days, I had another appointment later on in the day I had to go to. And by the way, guess what happened in that appointment? I got pulled back to the back room, had to put in the back room for another 25 minutes, waited again. I'm not joking, I watched my watch. 25 minutes before that person, they closed the door, no one was in the back room, they already called me back there. 25 minutes before they hacked. I mean, come on, man, that's ridiculous. It's insane. So, I'm irritated, but in both cases, I'm irritated, but when the person walks in, I had to watch myself and check myself and how I responded to them and how I interacted with them, right? Because it doesn't matter what I know about the Bible. If I can't, I believe everything within me wanted to take their head off. Everything within me wanted to cuss and swear at them and just yell at them and do something. But no, I just had to, I'm like, God, they're so frustrating. But I didn't do anything like that. I just said it. I said, we've been here for a while. It's not like you guys. This has like been the worst situation ever since we've been here. On the first one, that's what I said. It's like been here for an hour. Over an hour. What? Yeah. Almost an hour. That was the 45-minute call, the tip point before we even got back to the room. But after I told her that, waited another half an hour. See the doctor. I'm like, oh my God. Now you're really. The doctor comes in and he just has this whole bedside manner, telling jokes, positive attitude. Like, okay, that's good. So I didn't say nothing. But there's this. There's a way in which, okay, my point is, people say, well, I'm humble, walk with God, I'm humble. Then why can't you be humble to make the decision to confess your sin when you can't justify your actions based on how someone treated you? If you did something wrong, you did something wrong. You own your thoughts, your actions, your words. You can't blame it on someone else. Well, I did that because, You own you, how you think, how you act. And if you can't confess that, and humbleness to someone who clearly is the wrongdoer, who's the person who's doing evil to you, who's provoking you, who's irritating you. If you can't do that, then how are you humble again? Excuse me? You said you were humble. Then why don't you just do this one thing? It's not that hard, right? Who cares? This is what I'm talking about when I say that this is the lessons learned from these people. They claim the inability to do what they were claiming all along they represented. We talk to gods, but then why don't the gods tell you what my dream was then? It's similar to people who say, oh, I walk with God humbly, but yet when it comes to the little things, they just confess their sin, say I'm sorry to somebody, when that person is the evildoer, that person is the wretch, that person is the jerk, that person is the butt, who's being a total butt to you, because you responded in wickedness, you just discount the need to say I'm sorry because you associate, because they're wrong, therefore I don't need to say I'm sorry, because my actions are justified. No. If you're walking humbly with God, you realize that your actions are always under question. You realize your attitudes are always under question. You don't walk on lily white sunshine. No, you don't. You're a sinner, just like this guy. We all are. So it's just, you know what that is? Wait for it. Brutal. That's right. It is brutal, man. It is brutal. So it's twice today God tested my patience, and I failed miserably in the individual moments, but when it came to the interaction with the person, I passed that. I interacted with them nice, but not between me and God I didn't. No, I did not. I was livid. 45 minutes waiting, half an hour again to wait in the back room. Then another appointment later on in the day, happened again, back in the back room, waited 25 minutes. I'm like, God, why are you picking on me today, man? What's with this today? What's with me and you today and you picking on me with these doctors? What's up with this? So it was just one of those things, right? One was with Nancy this morning, and the other one was with me in the afternoon. So anyway, so the point is, when you get to this next level of how Daniel interacts with the conflict, it's totally opposite. There's no appealing to someone's ego. He doesn't deny and deflect, try to bide his time. And he certainly doesn't claim something he's not already said he's been doing all along. He is consistent. And here's what you find. So Arioch, he comes in, the captain of the army, is rounding up and killing people. Oh, the wise men, as the king decreed, he was killing them. And he stops to listen and answer Daniel, which I find to be incredibly insane. It just goes to shout out God's sovereignty from the mountaintops. Because you explain to me, I want you to in your mind for a second, just first, before I get to Daniel for a second. Here's a king that God said is the king of all kings of men. He has all the power and all the might of anybody, of all the kingdoms of men. He's the highest of all kings that is. That's why God called him the head of gold in the image. It's got to his head, by the way, which is why 6 years later he starts building this image. I think he's all that. But the point is, if he's the king of all kings of men, then here's a question for you. Who stays his hand? Nobody. And nothing other than God. Only God can make that king, that man. And that's, since God said he was the king of all kings, and God said he had the most power and might of all the kings, only God then could cause a change of his attitude and actions and will, when his will is to kill his wise men because he's irritated and agitated. What would make him pause and wait a day? Huh? Why? Why would he do that? He's irritated. He's sleepless. He's irritated. He's asked 3 times. These Yahoo buttheads have not given him the answer. He says, "Rrr." He says, kill them all. And Arioch, his right-hand guy, who, don't forget, this guy is bloodthirsty. You can't tell me he's not. He's the captain leader of his armies. He kills people for fun. This guy loves killing men and women and children. He does it for fun. The dude does it all day long, Mr. Testosterone. He's already defeated Assyria alongside the king. I'm sure he's with them then. He's with them now. They just dominate everybody, right? So here's this guy who's a brute of a man. A brute of a man. Not a girly man, a man's man. The dude is pecked, stacked, and locked with muscles. He's jacked. He's jacked. He's not out of weight. He's not out of shape. The dude is jacked. Okay, he didn't miss leg day. The dude is jacked. He's testosterone driven. And here's a guy, what's that in his way? Just the king. So when the king tells him what to do, why would he stop and pause? What does that speak to? Again, the king and Arioch, both testosterone-laden men who got nothing but nothing in front of them but them and their will. With only one difference, Arioch answers to the king. The king answers to no one. And here, we find in chapter 2, both of them were like, okay. And listen to Daniel? What is that about? It just shows you God's sovereignty that's so much for man's will. How do you explain that? That is not Nebuchadnezzar's will. He already told you what his will was. Answer me now. And he got irritated. Then he said, go kill him. Then he changes everything and waits to the next day to get an answer. That's because in between there, Arioch gives ear to Daniel, and then he also answers this question. It's insane to me. When you don't see that for what it is, you're missing a sovereignty of God example. For those who go, man's free will is God will not dominate and supersede our free will. Explain Daniel 2 then, bro. Explain it to me. How does Nebuchadnezzar's free will already tell you what it is? He tells you what it is. I want my answers, and I want them now, and I'm ticked. And because you didn't answer, you're all going to die. That's his free will. He already showed you his will. So why wasn't it carried out? Because God said no. That's why. Because God said basically, step off. Relax. Till tomorrow. What? It's amazing. Arioch, same way. Right? So, but what does Daniel do? Daniel, he reasons with him. Daniel in verse 15 said, why is the decree so hasty? Why is it so harsh? He appeals to the reasoning, saying, wait a second. He doesn't appeal to his ego. He could have. He could have said, hey, yo, big man. Hey, big man, how you doing, bro? What's up, big man? What's up? What's up, slayer of worlds, conqueror of kingdoms? He didn't say that. He could have, right? What's up, right arm of the king? What's up, Mac Daddy? He didn't say that. He just said, hey. Question for you. Why the hasty Why the harsh, hasty decision to kill everybody? As if inferring, which he later on did, can I have a chance? That's the second thing he did. First he reasons, then he doesn't deflect and deny, he offers a resolution. He offers resolution. This is the way in which godly, wise, godly men and women and men, you want to be a godly, say you're wise, prove it. Prove it. Appeal to reason in conflict, no matter what you are in that situation. Even if you're in the worst lowly state, everything's stacked against you, which you can't tell me it wasn't in Daniel's case, because it was. Right? So you have this whole thing about people saying one thing and do another. You're right about Revelation. I always mention that. Free will is slapped in the face with the fact that the Antichrist will come. The tribulation will happen, and you can't stop it. So much for free will. Because if we had free will, we want to stop that. But guess what? You can't stop the reign of terror of the Antichrist and the beast. It's going to happen. Too bad. And people will die. Can't stop that either. Sorry. So the reality is that you have this situation with Daniel where everything was stacked against him. His age, 16, approaching a man. His station, lowly, approaching a captain of the guard, and has to answer to a king of all kings, God said, of men. So don't give me this garbage. You don't understand my conflict. It's really different. See, my boss has this dirt on me, and it's my mom, and then my sister, and then it doesn't matter. Goodness gracious sakes. God gave you the most demonstratively ridiculous example of how this is a young man against a man of armies and a king of kings of all men that he has to confront. Did he waver? Did he use excuses? Did he say, well, that's just my personality type is to be crunch numbers and I hate conflict. Stop with the excuses of your personality type. I can't stand that either. Stop that. He didn't do that. He didn't go, well, I'm an introvert, so that's not what he did. You don't give in to your disposition of your, well, I did my Myers-Briggs DISC profile, and I'm an introvert, so no, it's not an excuse. Stop using your frailties, your shortcomings as an, think about that. Someone says, you know what, I don't like speaking in front of crowds. Okay, fine. Does that give you a right to violate Scripture when God says that you have to be humble in how you interact with people and love those that hate you? Does it? Did Jesus say love those that hate you as long as you're extroverted? Did he say that? Is it in your version somewhere? It's not in my version. It's in no version. None. But we keep lying and saying that that's a reason. Well, I'm extroverted, and it's easy for you. I'm introverted, so I don't like to do. I don't. Stop with the excuses. Right? I'm introverted, so therefore I can't love my enemies. When they punish me and they pummel me, man, it just makes me go to the shell. Okay, I get it. It hits us all differently. I get that. But once it hits you differently, we all are also under the same commandment. All of us, extroverts and introverts, we all have to love our enemies and bless those that persecute us. That's our job. We're commanded to do that, Jesus said. So you can't say, well, see, Daniel never used this. He didn't say, well, I'm just a young 16-year-old. Hey, give me a break, man. He didn't do that. I got my whole life ahead of me, man. He didn't do that. I just got here, man. Only 3 years, man. He didn't say that. He could have said all that stuff, but he didn't. He reasoned with him to the point of fact. Why the hasty decree? Then he brought resolution. Can I have time with the king? Can I have time with the king? Totally opposite of what a man, human, sinful mindset is. Their disposition is, I got to stroke the ego of the person over me. And then I got to deflect and deny because I don't want to deal with the fact that they have this authority. I'm afraid what they're going to do to me. And then I'm going to use hypocrisy and then claim something I've been saying I couldn't do all along. And Daniel's been claiming all along, and they know all along he's this wise man. He already been showing Aspenaz and Mizpah. He already been showing these guys that he's a wise young man. And so he knows that God has blessed him. He already knows this. So what's he doing? He relies on God and his provision for what you know you're capable of doing. That's what Daniel did. This is the way you handle conflict. You reason, you offer resolution, and you rely on God for what he's capable of doing. Notice how Daniel didn't go, I got this. I hate that phrase. He never said that. Daniel asked the king to give him time to tell the interpretation of the dream. Daniel at that time didn't have the interpretation. Daniel guessed, hoped that God would give it to him. Daniel said that knowing that he was already blessed by God with wisdom and understanding. Didn't know if God's going to bless him that much, but figured, you know what? Whether he lives or dies, it's up to God. It was that simple. Daniel knew he was already blessed with understanding and wisdom. It says so in chapter 1, verse 5 and 6, right? We already know he's blessed. But now, is that what 1 verse 5 and 6? Let me see. No, 1 verse 4, excuse me. And verse 4, he was already blessed with again, skillful wisdom and knowledge and understanding of sign. He already had been blessed by God. He already knew that. And now it's 3 years has gone by, and he's basically saying, to your point, Sister, he's like, look, I don't know if I can understand the dream or not. I know one thing, though. There's no way that I'm a 13-year-old boy, young man, young kid, who's going to be blessed by God, not recognizing. I recognize I'm blessed by God. And then the 10-day testing, plus down to the 3-year training, he already had 3 years of also seeing God intervene. Because S1R1 says, I'm not giving you 10 days, basically. That's my head. He had to appeal to his underling. Remember? Melzar. And when Melzar goes, okay, fine, I'll give you 10 days. And then he passed that test, and he gave him the rest of the 3 years the same way with the same thing to eat and drink. So Daniel already saw the hand of God for 3 years. He knew it coming in, and he saw it 10 days later, and he saw it throughout the whole rest of the 3 years. Daniel had a lot to go on, just like we do. So there's no excuse for him. He knew. He already saw God's hand when he brought him into captivity. He saw God's hand in the interaction of S1R1 and Melzar. He saw God's hand throughout the rest of the 3 years. And now this interaction comes. He's thinking, I don't know what's going to come of it. I just know one thing. God's clearly in my life and in my 3 buddies' lives. So I'm just going to go ahead and the word secret, it doesn't mean, it means mystery unknown. It's the phrasing in the Hebrew. It doesn't mean as in hidden or concealed. It could mean that in other translations. And there's different ways to use this word. But this particular usage of the word does not mean hidden or concealed. It just means unknown. Unknown. Secret. Unknown. Sometimes someone says something like, hey, what's your secret? It's unknown. I make it with love. What's your secret to making your turkey so good? It's love. And I brine it. Okay, whatever. You brine it and you love it? Okay. You know, some people have, a secret means unknown. It's unknown, but to God. And Daniel knew that, because how can anybody know what someone else dreamt? It's unknown. Nebuchadnezzar even said, I forgot what I dreamt. It's been gone from me. That's what he said. That's why he's saying, you know what, but if you tell it to me, I'll remember, I'll recall it, so why don't you tell it to me? And they're like, I don't know, why don't you tell me? I already told you. First of all, I'm asking you to answer my question, and secondly, I forgot. So you tell me, and I'll recall it based on what you're saying to me, because I do remember sketchy stuff. I just can't tell it to you. I don't remember it all. And Daniel's hearing this going, there's no way I'm going to know what a person dreamt, especially when that person is not going to tell you. And thirdly, he forgot some of it. So Daniel knows right away, only God can answer this secret, this unknown. There's unknown things in this universe. There's unknown things in life. Only God knows. Only God knows. Right? And so Daniel knew that. That's what the word secret speaks to. The unknown that only God knows. The infinite nature of God, right? And the finite nature of us. So when you go to chapter 2, not only does he reason, but he offers resolution. Then he relies on God, because you saw that when he goes right to his friends. He goes in verse 17. Went to the house, made things known to Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, his companions, which is his dear friends. And he says in verse 18 that they would desire the mercies of God of heaven concerning the mystery of the secret, that Daniel and his fellow companions should not perish with the rest of the wise men. Then was the secret, in verse 19, revealed to Daniel in a night vision, meaning it was developed. It was brought into awareness to Daniel. So what did Daniel do? Relied on God. Like you said, he had no idea. All he knew was, God's already blessed me. He's shown me he's in my life with that 10-day trial. He continued for the last 3 years to watch over us and give us safe passageway to not being defiled. Other children of the Hebrews were not so fortunate and not so wise. He sees the contrast between him, other Chaldeans, other people taken away from different conquerings of the king, other Hebrew children willing to take of the king's table of his wine and drink, but he and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah did not. And he saw that they were uniquely different from their own Hebrew kindred people, I should say, and the others. He saw a distinction between others that aren't Hebrew, those that are Hebrew, who didn't care too much, have a high standard, had a low standard of living, whereas they had a high standard of living, honoring God. And he saw God blessing them from the very beginning of the captivity to 10 days in to the rest of the last 3 years. I mean, God gave him a lot to go on. I mean, he needs that. At 16 years old, you just can't go from nothing to rely on God and know at a thin air. You got to base it on something. I mean, he didn't have the Bible, if you will. He has to base it on something, right? Got to base it on something. So God gives us a foundation, in our case, of his word, revealing who he is and what he has to say. In Daniel's case, he gave Daniel examples. Oh, you darn well know him in your life. Because at 13 years old, to know what you knew and have understanding and have skillful wisdom and to have this deep understanding of circumspectly seeing yourself, understanding what you're hearing, and be able to explain things, understanding science. At 13, you're able to be really a savant. And you have this courage in you. You know it's not just innate. That's God-given. He knew that. Then 10 days later, he saw God again move in when, again, the Melzar conversation, the S1R said, nope. And then Melzar goes, okay. And he saw that come to a good conclusion. Then you have, again, like I said, the end of the 3 years in total. So now, my whole point about that is that people tend to use their personality traits, their situations, their circumstances to say, I can't do this, and you don't understand, and it's not like that. Tell me again. So again, if you can't extrapolate these lessons from Daniel and apply it to your life and convict yourself where you should be, I convicted myself earlier today. I just told you. I was a horse's patoot and how I was acting between myself, my wife, and God, just venting how I was feeling about it. But when the other persons who sinned against me came into the room, then I just bit my tongue. So I passed the second test but failed the first test. Just being honest. Can you be honest as well and say to yourself, when did you pass and fail these tests of how to apply yourself in situations where your patience is tried, where your testimony is tried, whether it be at work, at home, on the road, or whatever, right? So we have to be honest with ourselves and say, hey, when someone is in authority over me or when someone wrongs me, do I respond the way Daniel did, with reason, with resolution, and relying on God? Or do I get irrational with no reason because I'm feeding into my emotions and the emotions of the person by stroking their ego? I go into deflected denial. I'm not guilty. I'm not the one. And then I go to the hypocrisy route. That's what that leads to. When you rely on when you go to your emotions, when you appeal to your emotions or the emotions of another person, then you go to deflect and deny, and all that leads to is hypocrisy 101. And you're so ignorant you don't see it. And I see it so many times in Christianity. In humanity, you see it. People say, oh, I love my wife. I love my son. I love my whatever. So then you say, if they came to you to make up for the wrong they did to you, would you then just, no! I thought you said you loved them, and I thought you said you understand God's love, but then you just said that they wronged you. I'm asking if they came to you with a penance, with a sense of contriteness, would you, no! Okay, then you got a problem. You got a problem. How you don't see that? If you don't see that for what that is, then I'm serious. You got some serious, deep, you're not going to inherit. It's just sorry. You're not. It's not funny. You say, what is the gold, silver, precious stones? And what is the actual 30, 60, 100 fruit? I'll tell you what it's not. Not living like that. That ain't it. You can know all you want about God and His Word. You keep living like that with your relationships and caring less about examples that Daniel showed us how to live out your faith. You care less about learning from that, then you got no shot. None! Of being a faithful one, being a mature one. You got no shot at all. You're dead to rights. Put yourself in the crosshairs of God. You're done. You got to make mistakes, but my goodness gracious, why are you limiting them? What is wrong? Jesus said in John 8:12, that those who continue to follow me will not have a practice of living in darkness, but they will have an ongoing, the light of the life. In other words, we're going to fall into darkness, but don't make it a practice to live in it. To make it a practice to, you have times when you make a bad choice and you say a bad word or bad things, or you do bad things, you think bad things. It's all normal. But don't make that your practice. Don't make that your way of life. Don't make that the way that you are, your disposition. My goodness gracious. Do you think Daniel didn't sin? Sure he did. But are you focused on, am I going to reason with them when conflict comes up? Am I going to bring resolution? And through it all, am I going to rely on God for the answer? Because that's the godly thing to do as a woman or a man in Christ. That's it. Daniel had 3 years to mature, just like Paul, that's right. They came from different spiritual situations, but had the same experience of that 3 years, right? So then you get to the same point of, as you fast forward further on, and the rest of the story there, then when Daniel comes to him, he tells him that in verse 23, he thanks God before he approaches the king. After Daniel does the reasoning, then he goes to resolution, and then he relies on God. Then he also, before he goes to the king, he makes sure that he gives thanks to God for the fact that it's him who brought him to that state to give reason in that to have a conversation of reason. It was him. It was God who brought about the idea of resolution. It was God who gave the answer. It was God who did everything from the inception up to the ultimate resolution. And he gives thanks to God in verse 23 when Brother Todd asked about that. When he says, "I thank you," it means I praise you, and I'm actually extenuatingly praising you, God. That's what he says in verse 23. Because you gave me, my fathers and oh my God, my Father who had given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what we desired of you, for thou hast now made known to us the king's matter. He makes it clear that he gives recognition to God before he even addresses the king. By himself. He's not saying this to King Nebuchadnezzar or to Arioch. This is between him and God. So interesting enough, so when you are in a conflict situation, the evidence is just, I always do that. I'm a reasonable man. I'm a reasonable woman. I focus on resolution. I'm always relying on God. You know how you prove yourself if that's true or not? That's how you prove yourself. Do you have a preface before you started? Before you started to say you reason with people, then you have a resolution. You're always relying on God for the answer. Test yourself. Going into the situation where you already are reflecting on God's mighty hand in your life that you knew was all about Him. Were you? At the end of the reasoning and the resolution and the relying on God bringing the answer, did you before you acted on that aspect of God providing the actual reconciliation, did you give thanks to God for the process that from the inception through the actual reconciliation, it was all from Him? Did you check yourself in your spirit to make sure your attitude, your mindset, your behavior, you're in the right space with God, the right head space, the right spirit? Did you do that? You see, it's not just the pocket of the actual conflict. It's what leads up to it. Did you reflect back on that to derive from that the strength to do the right things, a reason, resolution, rely on God? Then when you did that, did you on the back end of it, did you also go, oh wait, stop, pause. It's time to do that Selah moment now, and thank God for all He has done. For He gave me the ability to even seek reason and resolution and rely on Him. I thank God for that foundation He's laid. I can rest on these memories of these scriptures and experiences and these knowledge. And now, in the moment of the conflict, He gave me reason and resolution and rely on Him. And now that after that's been seen clearly what to do and it brings reconciliation, do you stop and give thanks to God for what He's done? Or do you just take the credit and say, I'm just a wise man, that's how I roll, just a wise woman, Really? Really? Because most people do that. They like the whole, atta girl, atta boy, We all do that, right? And Satan laughs. He loves that. Daniel, 16 years old. Not only is he showing this girth of knowledge and wisdom and trustworthiness, he describes himself as God describes him as imputing His wisdom in him and his trustworthiness. At 16 years old, he exhibited such control of his emotions, of his mindset, and of total, again, reflection on what God has done, so he could reason, so he could focus on resolution, so he could rely on God. And then when it was all done, then he also still kept perspective. Before he addressed the king the next morning, he was already livid the previous day, he pauses to thank God for all he has done. Recognizing it's from God and God alone that all this has been made possible. That he stopped the anger of the king. That he stopped the will of Arioch to be carried out to kill and murder. That he is the one who provided the answer to the secret. It's unbelievable. Daniel, I'm telling you, it's not normal. It's just not normal. But it can be done. God shows you. So that's what God expects of life. You say, I'm a mature one. How do I know who a mature one? Have actions like this. Have responses like this in conflict. Vet yourself. Go back in your mind with conversations you've had with previous conflicts, with loved ones, with coworkers, with neighbors, friends, interactions with people at the grocery store or whatnot, at the gas pump, along the road rage, right? Go back and vet yourself and ask yourself the question, did I in the midst of the heat of the conflict, you can't get any hotter than Arioch coming at you with already blood on his hands of already killing people. He was already killing them when he came to Daniel. You can't get any more intense conflict than Daniel was dealing with, okay? Plus the power he had to end his life, right? Okay? He had the power and the ability to do it, and the right to do it in man's eyes. So during the heat of the pinnacle of that conflict, did you first reflect back on what God's already done in your life and provided to you to trust that he will then also carry you through? And you show that by having the calmness to reason. Not respond with emotion or mental state, which is hard for this idiot. But hey, Daniel showed it's possible. 16 years old pulled it off. What excuse do I have at 54? None. Did you secondly focus on resolution? Did you thirdly rely on God through it all? And did you, after it's all said and done, did you go back on your memories of your previous conflict that you had interactions with? Did you, after it was all done, give thanks to God? Or did you actually walk away going, boy, you know what, God, I'm just good at that? Oh, no. I mean, come on, we've all done these mistakes, right? We've done the mistake where we didn't go in it the right way to begin with. We messed it up in the midst of it. If we did those two right, we at the back end messed it up there because we just got lax, forgot to thank God and remember all the blessings come from God. We took the credit to ourselves, or we tried to rationalize it. I've heard one guy once say to me, I'm a wise man. And I go, wise people, men or women, never say they're wise. It's like one of the tenets of being wise. You never say it. That's like saying I'm proud to be humble. That makes no sense. None. You don't impute yourself to be wise, nor do you say to yourself, I'm proud to be humble. It's observed. It's known. If it's true, don't say that about yourself. That's just a clear indication that you're consumed with your ego. So, going back now to the story again at the very end of the story now, going to chapter 2 at the very end, that's these lessons I wanted to show about what Daniel learned. And he also, during the explanation to Nebuchadnezzar, makes it abundantly clear to Nebuchadnezzar, who doesn't know who God is. He doesn't know that Daniel's resting on. This is the three parts of the conversation. With Daniel isolated, he rested in the transition of what God had already done in his life, of the captivity, knowing he was already filled with this skillful wisdom, this incredible circumspect understanding, this unbelievable depth of knowledge. And he knew that was a skill that God had to give him. It wasn't just something he just earned on his own. He's 13. It was a gift from God. He knew that. The 10-day later trial, that whole benefit of the Ashpenaz conversation versus the Melzar conversation, then the balance of the 3 years and how he was favored by God. He knew, in contrast to his other Hebrew children, in contrast to the other people in the court chamber, he knew he was favored, and his 3 friends. So he rested on that, then he acted with reason and with resolution and relying on God. Then after that, he reflected and gave thanks and praise to God. All that being done, that's all about him. That's all about him circumspectly showing his skuthathuno, seeing himself circumspectly. But even still, he didn't lose sight of the one last thing that he has to now do. He has to now, within that circumspect conversation, to diffuse the conflict. Now he has to put the final cherry on the top and wrap it up in a bow by approaching an arrogant, ignorant, dumb person when it comes to not knowing who God is. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't know. He knows nothing about nothing when it comes to the true God of Israel. He knows nothing. So Daniel knows this. And he can't explain to him those things we just talked about. The preface, the duration of the during process of how to interact with the conflict, how to reflect back and give God the praise for the resolution, the reconciliation of the conflict. How do I now express this to someone who knows no point of reference to who God is and everything that I know about who he is in my life? What do I do? What does Daniel do? He shows you what he does, and Daniel does it in a very awesome way. And Daniel, he says it to him in and it says this in verse 29, O king, your thoughts came into thy mind upon your bed, what should come to pass, and he that reveals secrets made known unto you what shall come to pass. In verse 30, but as for me, the secret is not revealed to me, but for any wisdom I have more than any living, but for their sakes he is made known. He makes the king know everything I'm about to tell you has nothing to do with me. He makes it abundantly. He pulls no punches. He makes clear that he doesn't want any glory or fame or accolades from men. I want you to know this is God, and God alone, who's giving you this dream, and it's God and God alone who gave me the understanding of what you dreamt, told me what you dreamt, and told me the understanding of it. He makes it very clear to him. So yet God also gives us different temperance, right? Which makes them appear to be more calm and appearing, to have God's wisdom, but may not. That is correct. How is that accounted for? Filled with God. Skip that sentence. I know what you're saying, though. So when people tend to be calm, extroverted, and they got God's wisdom, they got God's patience, when inside, you don't know what's going on in their head. Inside their head, they could be cussing you upside down the other. You have no idea. Inside their head, they could be shaking like a leaf. You think they're strong inside, like some concrete pillar, but they could be just shaking in their boots, just not talking, just showing like a duck on the water, the stillness on the, the duck on the water analogy, where they look all calm underneath. They're that's the duck, right? Some people are like ducks. They look all extroverted and calm. Oh, they got God's patience and wisdom, but inside they're just devastated. They're destroyed inside. They're a wreck. There's like an apocalypse going on in their heart, in their mind, in their spirit. They're wrecked, but they hide it really well, right? So how do you, to your point, how do you discern? It's not in how they act. It's in everything. It's in all aspects. It's in how, it's in the tone, it's in the words, and in the actions. We tend to say, you are what you do. No, that's not really true, because we're sinners, and I sin. Is that who I am? No, I'm in Christ. That's the first and most important thing. But I am a sinner too, right? So Satan's lie is to make you think you are what you do. Well, if that's the case, I got no chance in Hades of being seen to be good in God's eyes, because I constantly make mistakes every single day throughout the day. I'm a sinner. I fall short all the time, right? If I based on what I did, that's crazy. I have to see myself constantly, be reminded constantly of who God is in my life, what he's done for me, and in light of, in lieu of, in contrast to my fleshy, sinful man, what this new man in me is in Christ. I want to feed that man, right? I have both warring, as Paul says, in me, as we both do, right? Whoever is stronger is the one I feed the most, right? So it goes back to how do you don't really want to think of people from what you see. It's not what you see, it's what you hear and what you discern. And how do they express? How do they express? Because I don't care if you're extroverted or introverted. It doesn't matter. How do you express? How do you voice? Whether it's, if I'm mute, if I can't talk. How do you communicate? Okay? How do you communicate that you have a reflection on God in your life, that you are drawing from which to resolve the conflict, which you show through reason, resolution, and relying on God, which you then, thirdly, communicate clearly that you have reflected on that, because the fourth thing you've done is you deflect away from anything to yourself, to attribute anything to yourself as to how and why the resolution came about, to how and why the ability to reason came about, to how and why it all came to be reconciled. You give all of that glory and praise and thanks and honor and insight to God. Do you do that? You don't have to be extroverted or introverted to see that for what it is. You can pick up, I don't care if you're introverted, I don't care if you're extroverted. That doesn't matter. You can't hide that process. Sorry. I don't care if you're a woman or a man. I don't care if you're black, white, or brown. I don't care what you are. Any human being, any, of either gender, of any ethnicity and culture, it does not matter, of young or old, there's going to be, and Daniel's showing you at 16 years of age, he had a masterful handle on reflection and drawing from the blessings of God, from which then to apply that, how to resolve the conflict with reason, resolution, relying on him. Then and the last part of that, the third part, that's first part, reflection on drawing the strength from what God has done, who God is. To secondly, resolve the conflict through, again, reason, resolution, relying on God. To then thirdly, step back and reflect and thank God. To then fourthly, then now how do you then explain what just happened to someone who has no reference point to who God is and what he's done in your life? They have no idea. How do you explain that to someone who has no reference point, no vantage point, no perspective, no nothing? How do you do that? Do you do it with a sense of kind of talking about your accomplishments or what you have done? Let me tell you what I have been through. Or you just simply say, I know nothing. Anything I know is from God. You see, people don't tend to do that, right? I don't care if you're extrovert or introvert. That's what we're supposed to do. So that's the end of the reflections I want to give from chapter 2. And then he goes into this image, and we've already talked about that 2 times already. One message about the image itself, and secondly, we read the chapter exegetically last week. But I want to end now with focusing on the last part of chapter 2 into chapter 3. Last part of chapter 2, when the king hears all this about what Daniel says to him, the last part of it, the king in verse 46, his response was to fall on his face and worship Daniel and offer him oblation and sweet odors. And you know why that was? I told you before, because Daniel was so filled with relying on what God had done. He pulled from that to know how to act in a conflict, to bring reason, resolution, and rely on God. Then when God gave him the answer, he gave thanks and praise to God. Then he talks to a man with no reference point but from ignorance and polytheism, and explains to him that it's God and God alone who gave you the dream, and it's God and God alone who told me what the dream was and what it means. I don't have any knowledge and wisdom of that. It's all from God. And because of this uniqueness of the 16-year-old young man, because of his honesty, because of his brokenness, because of his humility, because of his ability to swallow his pride, to not stroke the king's ego, he was so uniquely different in everything, how he responded, how he acted, how he conducted himself, how he held himself. Everything was so uniquely different that the king says to him, he didn't say anything, he just prostrates to him and says, he wants to offer, what's he say? He fell on his face and commanded that they should offer offerings and sweet odors to him, verse 46 of chapter 2. And notice how Daniel did not say, oh, get up, I'm not a god. He didn't say that. Because Daniel knew where this was coming from. He wasn't worshiping Daniel, the person. Nebuchadnezzar was worshiping God in his life. I'm telling you, this is why the confounding question could be like, when does a man accept worship who is a godly man, or a woman who's a godly woman? Where's there anybody in Scripture who accepts worship who is a godly man and woman who does not say, I'm not God, bro. You got this all wrong. He didn't do that. Why? You ever ask yourself that question? Why? Is Daniel all of a sudden now a different guy? Did he go from being humble and godly to all of a sudden being a complete horse's patoot? Is that what happened? No. So what happened then? What's God saying to us here? That Nebuchadnezzar saw in Daniel the actual spirit of Almighty God. He saw in him the wisdom of God. He heard it in him, and he saw in Daniel this truthfulness, this purity. That later on it's going to mention this about the Daniel lion's den. I'm going to show you this. I'll skip in advance and show you something. If you go to chapter 6, we're way in advance here. But there's this whole phrasing in chapter 6 in verse 22 when the king goes to King Daniel, who's over not the king of the Medes and Persian Empire, but he's been made king over Babylon. That Darius goes to check on Daniel in the lion's den. In verse 22 he says, he actually checking on him. And then Daniel says, my God has sent his angel and has shut the lions' mouths, in verse 22 of Daniel 6. They have not hurt me, for as much before of him, purity was found in me. Say, what do you say? What? What? Purity, innocence was found in me. The word is zaku. 6:22. I am telling you, God is telling you, Daniel was not a normal human. He was a human with a dead spirit before there was grace through faith, who God had infused his wisdom to work through him in such a way it was profound. That God showed his purity of trustworthiness through him in such a way it was profound. So profound that it moved the king of all the kings of men, a polytheist, ignorant to who God is person, and King Nebuchadnezzar, to respond by prostrating to him. Not because he was worshiping a 16-year-old boy or young man. No. He's worshiping the God who had in essence filled him. Almost like a pre-incarnation symbolism. He wasn't pre-incarnated of Christ, that's not what I'm saying. It was almost as if it was a symbol, it was like a foreshadow how God was going to one day become flesh. He was like showing a snippet of his wisdom and trustworthiness, just two facets of him in Daniel. And Nebuchadnezzar's response was to worship. Wow. And now you see why in Jesus' day, showing all the aspects and facets of God's love and character, well, they worshiped him in human form. Another shot across the bow, tip of the hat, God's telling the Jewish people, when I come to you later on as a baby in the manger, and I grow up later on, and you keep asking, how can God be a man? How can he be some humble person? You mean like your guy Daniel? Remember the king worshipped him? Why is that again? Oh yeah, because God's wisdom and trustworthiness was so great, was so profoundly, uniquely palatable in his life. It's the innate reaction Nebuchadnezzar had, just to worship him. And Daniel did not say, worship me. He didn't say, bring it on. He didn't say, stop, I'm not God. He didn't say, bring it on. No. Because the reality is that Daniel was just letting you know, as the rest of us know, it was God he was worshiping in Daniel, not Daniel. And that's why he says that. In verse 47, the king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods. You see? He didn't say you are God. No. He sees Daniel with God's wisdom and trustworthiness in his life as this right-hand arm of God, like this representation of God's emissary, of God's diplomat, of God's messenger to him. And that's worthy of praise and worship to Nebuchadnezzar. Because he then, in his mind, when he sends out Arioch or other emissaries or ambassadors for him, he expects them to be treated as an extension of him. So he's treating Daniel as an extension from heaven itself. Understand that. That's the impact that Daniel made in Nebuchadnezzar. A 16-year-old young man, 16, made Arioch, Mr. Bloodthirsty, testosterone, captain of the guard who slays people for a living, men, women, and children, made him stop in his tracks, listen and answer Daniel. Made the king of all kings, who has nobody to stop his will but God himself, wait till the next day, and the next day Arioch rustled him in hastily before Nebuchadnezzar, and he answers him with this deflection of, it's not about me, it's about God. Nebuchadnezzar has never seen such an answer, such a way in which he answered, such an embodiment of this character, of this young man. He was so just taken up with this whole godly experience. It wasn't just that he answered the secret of a dream that only he knew and he forgot parts of it. That wasn't the thing that wowed him. It wasn't the dynamic interpretation of the dream. That wasn't what wowed him. It was everything that wowed him. It was that and more. He knew himself. How'd I go from agitated to irritated, sleepless night before, woken up irritated? The 3 times I've asked my Yahoo people to answer the question, they kept deflecting. I got angry and said, kill them all. Why did my general not kill you again? He never does. He always does what I tell him to do. He never just stops. He never disobeys me. Why did my general of my army stop again? Why did I wait again for the next day to hear from you? What happened? I believe that Nebuchadnezzar, with all his mind, God opened up his mind, a flood of thoughts came to him, like only God could have stayed his irritation, his impatience, his furious rage. Only God could have stayed Arioch, his faithful right arm of captain of his guard, could have stayed his arm from continuing his decree to kill them all. Nebuchadnezzar knew that. He's like, what could make this? And he sees this Daniel, this 16-year-old young man. He goes, now it all makes sense. Because God's wisdom and trustworthiness was so permeating out of this young 16-year-old young man, it just floored Nebuchadnezzar. And it caused this not this visceral reaction of hate, but this visceral reaction, I just wants to offer him praise and offerings. And he goes on to talk about praising your God above all gods, the King, the Lord of all kings, and the revealer of secrets, and seeing that thou could expose this secret. And then when I get to the latter part of this chapter, that gives you the background to chapter 3. So I want you to understand all this, okay? So understanding all this, now you're going to understand why Nebuchadnezzar says in verse 48, he gave him great gifts and he made him ruler. We talked about it before, because later on, Belteshazzar, his son, tries to give him gifts, and Daniel's like, no, that ain't going to happen. That ain't happening. Because you don't give gifts on a sense of trying to honor him. In this case, you could see clearly Nebuchadnezzar is honoring God in Daniel. Daniel receives the gifts. So there is a difference. Someone says, I don't ever receive gifts. I don't ever receive rewards. Yeah, it depends on the intent behind them. If the intent is to thank God in your life and how God has moved in and through your life, then that's a distinguishment you have to understand. Daniel understood the distinguishment, so he accepted these gifts. So you get to this place, all of a sudden it says, and he gave him, they rule over the whole province of Babylon. Now, this goes to over here. So if you go on the map here, I'm going to take the map off the piece. So here you have Babylonia, right? Here's Babylonia right here. See, it says Babylonia right there, right? Well, Babylon's right here. So it says over the whole province of Babylon. So that goes all the way here. This is the whole province of Babylon. Babylonian Empire went over here to down here. The Babylonian Empire went into Judah. He took Jerusalem, remember? And went down here, over into here a little bit, down to here. So he put Daniel over the whole province of this region. Okay? He's sitting at the king's gate, it says. He sits at the king's gate. That makes him a higher level of station of person. Not like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going to be stated later on in verse 49 that they're overlooking works or services. They're like policemen, where he is like an officer of the state. Like he is working directly with the king. And the king makes this image in chapter 3, and the region, it says, I can show you in chapter 3, it says he makes this, and the valley of Dura in chapter 3, verse 1, this image, which is right over in here somewhere. We don't know exactly where it's at, but it's northwest of Babylon, somewhere over in here, the valley of Dura. It's somewhere in here, okay? So this valley of Dura is northwest of Babylon. Daniel's made over the whole region, right? So now that gives you some background of two things that are true. One, Daniel is seen uniquely, distinctly as someone that Nebuchadnezzar has never encountered before. Clearly, he is unique. And clearly Nebuchadnezzar said so. And clearly his actions dictate such. Right? Clearly. He did not act that way towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There was not even a mention of them by Nebuchadnezzar until Daniel brought them up at the end of the chapter. So now at the end of the chapter, in chapter 2, verse 49, Daniel requested of the king, verse 49, that he should set them over the affairs or the service or the work of the province. So they're overseeing work. But Daniel, it says, sat in the gate of the king. That makes him a governor or a prince. I want you to see something. If you go over to Jeremiah 39:3, go to Jeremiah 39:3. I'm going to show you. In Jeremiah 39:3, he makes this comment about this understanding of sitting in the gate. Now watch this. Jeremiah 39:3. And all the princes of the king of Babylon came in and sat in the middle of the middle gate, even Nagashazar, Sambagnego, Sarasum, can't tell these names, Mabaris, Nagashazar, and Rambag, and all these weird names, with all the residue of the princes of the kings of Babylon. The point is, I want you to see here, this phrasing, sitting at the gate, is commensurate with who? Princes, governors. It's the word for overseer, or the ones who's in charge. It's the same exact word. Sar. Same exact word that was used of Ashpenaz, who was over his eunuchs. Same exact word used of Michael the archangel. Remember? Yeah. Go to Daniel chapter 10. Look at Daniel 10. Daniel 10. Speaking of Michael the archangel. Michael the archangel in verse 20. It says to us that Michael in verse 21, but I will show you and that which is noted in the scripture of truth, there is none that holdeth with me these things, but Michael the who? The Tsar, the prince, the governor, which is associated with having a seat with the king and the kingdom, which gives you the idea of how this word is used. It's used to show a high level of authority and oversight. It's used of Michael the archangel, it's used of princes in the kingdom, and it's used of the same verbiage for Daniel. So please understand the gravity of his uniqueness over the affairs of services that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were doing is not the same thing as Daniel. He's like governor versus policeman. That's a whole different thing. Let's get real. He is up there in a station, big time, more like senator, right? He's up there. So when you go back to Daniel chapter 2, I want you to remember that, and you read this. Then you go look at this Daniel privilege in verse 48. Not only is it over the whole jurisdiction of Babylon, it says, and chief of all the governors. You see? So not only is he some overseer of others, of all those who are like him, he's over all those. He's pretty high up there. I mean, dude, that's like Secretary of State, right? That's like Department of Defense. He's like the Attorney General above all. I mean, he's like the guy. Like all judges go. You know, he is the guy. He's two things over the whole province, and he's the chief of all the people that are like him, that are already unique. He's the elite of the elite. It's unbelievable. Has a note that the king's court is the gate of the king. Yeah, the king. It says that the king's court, the gate of the king. But I wanted you to see this phrasing, and how that king, the gate of the king, is being used in Jeremiah 39:3 to connect it with these princes, these governors. And then I want to see that word governor being used to connect the Michael the archangel. I'm with you. I just think it's fascinating to start to trace down. There's really no real clarity unless you trace down these connections and you start to see. Wait a second here. Daniel has a very high station. And of that high station, he's the highest of all of those. It's almost like saying, I'm a first ballot Hall of Famer. I'm the highest of all the gold medalists in the Olympics, but of all the gold medalists in the Olympics, of the Olympians, you're the standard from which all of them fall under you. The truth is, of all the first time ballot Hall of Famers, he leads the list. Oh my gosh. That's what it's basically telling you. He is a very acknowledged mighty hand in the land of Babylon. Very much so. So yeah, he must have had first row seat to all decisions making in the king's plans. Right. Which now brings to question the interesting comments. Now with that being said, you start to see chapter 3 unfold as we can do intro to this where we end for tonight. So to get clear, we're now 6 years later. How do I know that? Septuagint said now it's in the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar. King James doesn't tell you that, chapter 3. That the Septuagint does. So remember, Septuagint is great for what? Dates and context. I always side with the Septuagint for dates and context. Why? Because the Septuagint goes with older manuscripts to recover the Word of God. However, I cannot word study from it because it went from Hebrew to Greek to English, and there's no interpretation for that The original Hebrew is gone. So for word study, I'm stuck with the King James. I have to use that and the concordance and the Old Testament word studies and Wilson's Old Testament word study. I use that among other things in the concordance, right? But when it comes to dates and context, Septuagint is 100% very useful. Case in point right here. In Daniel 3, very first verse of Septuagint tells you it's in the 8th year. You're like, what's up with that? Well, that's interesting. King James doesn't even mention it. Well, thank you very much, Septuagint, for once again giving us some added flavor, some added nuance. 6 years had gone by between this interaction we just read about with this image and the dream and everything. Daniel just had this impact in Nebuchadnezzar, this high station he was put in. Now we're 6 years later of him being in that station. 6 years later, he's in that state. Which means, guess what? What's that mean? We're 6 years later, and he's over all of the people that are also governors and princes like him. He's over all of them because he's chief of all those guys. And he's over the whole region of Babylon. Think about something for a minute. Would it make sense that he's not in one place all the time? No. This is the misnomer people think. Well, it says he sat in the gate of the king. It doesn't. That's a phrasing to represent his station. His station of high level access. Not his stationary position, his station of high level access and his prosperity that the king gave him and this high influence that he had. Major impact. But almost akin to Joseph and Pharaoh. Remember? And Pharaoh said clearly, he's second to me. No one answers. He only answers to me. No one else. Just me. Right? That's what Pharaoh said about Joseph. He didn't say that about Daniel, but it sure sounds real close to that. Like he was in this second tier of people. There was the king, and there was a second tier of people. And it sure sounds like Daniel was up there with like Arioch, by the way. Think about that. Arioch, the testosterone, bloodthirsty, captain of the guard, slayer of men, conqueror of kingdoms, is now like almost in cahoots, if you will. He's almost at the same level. They're probably, I don't know if they're the same level or not, but I would imagine that the king would take Arioch's word into high regard in a similar manner he would to Daniel's. And now you're thinking, if you're Arioch, like this kid's 16 years old and out of nowhere, he's at the same level as me now. We've conquered kingdoms together. We've won wars together. One interaction with you, and just like that, he's the same as me. Imagine that jealousy, that shock, that adjustment in your brain. Like, how does that work? How does a grown man with like notches in his belt of all the people he's killed, all the armies and all the victories he's won, right, for the king? Now he's on less than or same as playing field with Daniel's influence of his word to the king, of his access to the king. It's pretty amazing. I'm just telling you, I mean, Daniel, it's just amazing. So, with that being said, chapter 3 opens up, and he says that Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits. Right? So a cubit is 18 inches. Right? So 60 of those bad boys. It's pretty tall. Right? So you think about this thing. So you're looking at, what is that? I'm thinking in my mind right now. I didn't do the math in my head. I should have done it before we got here, and I didn't write it down. So I wasn't going to go to that point right now. I'm going to gloss over. We'll get back to that on Sunday. But in the breadth thereof, the width is 6 cubits. And he raised it up in the plain of Dura, that's northwest of Babylon, and the province of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, I want to focus on this whole aspect of Daniel and where he was. So Daniel the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors, which is remember, Daniel's chief of all the governors. So it says all the governors and the captains and the judges and the treasurers and the counselors and the sheriffs and all the rulers of the provinces to come to dedication of the image Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Verse 3. Then the princes and the governors and the captains and the judges and the treasurers, the counselors and the sheriffs and the rulers and the provinces were gathered together on dedication of the image Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And then now it adds, and they stood before the image and Nebuchadnezzar that he had set up. Now here's the interesting part here. There's two schools of thought so far. Is Daniel part of the governors? Or, if he's not, why not? Or, if you think he's not, Is it because, thank you, Todd, for the math. I didn't do it in my head. 90 feet tall, thank you. So if you're saying that Daniel wasn't there because he's not of the governors, because he's the chief of the governors, okay, because think about that. I could see if I'm above you, just because I have the same station of you, but I'm the highest of all of you, doesn't mean I'm there, but it would allude to I'm probably there. But I can see it both ways, where they could say, okay, because he's the chief of the governors, it doesn't necessitate he has to be there. It didn't say all, it just said the governors. He's the chief of the governors. You see, he wasn't just any governor. He was the top one. So is he included in part of the governors, or is he exempt because he's the chief? Going back to verse 48 of chapter 2, right? So, okay. So, all right, so then you go into this. Keep that in your mind. Either he's there, or he's not there because he's the chief. Let the Bible speak for itself. Let's go to verse 4. Then a herald announcement cried aloud. An announcer cried aloud. To you it is commanded, O people, and nations, and languages, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And whoso, verse 6, falls not down and worships, shall the same hour be cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Now, verse 7 and 8 clearly tell you that a timeline has fast forwarded. You know that because of the phrasing, therefore then, or at that time. It speaks to a later time, a time in which they started to instill this. So he didn't tell you, unfortunately, we don't know at what hour they would do this musical enchantment, then cue you up to then fall down and worship this image. All we know is it was a regular thing, and you had to do it. You go to the fire furnace if you don't do it, and it happened regularly at a certain hour. We don't know if it was multiple times throughout the day, one time throughout the day. I don't know. It doesn't tell you that. It just tells you that there was a regularity of this. It was mandatory or death. Right? So my question is, if Daniel was there, we're going to end with this part of the story for tonight. We're going to read back into this on Sunday. If Daniel was there as one of the governors, which is the excuse you'd have, that's the exegesis you'd have, that's the excuse, that's the exegesis you'd have to use to say, okay, he's one of the governors, therefore he's there. Okay. I'm not, if then, if that's your conclusion, then he was there when Nebuchadnezzar said these things and said nothing that we see recorded. Or did he say something that then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego heard him say, we ain't doing this? Is that? One of the two things is true. Either he said nothing, and neither did they, which is kind of odd. How do you explain that? Why would they not right there say, well, we're not doing that? We saw Daniel already question Arioch when he was going to kill people. He said, why the hasty decision? If the resolution to not worship the image is thrown into a fiery furnace, that seems to be the similar mindset that if Daniel was confronted earlier with a problem that was resulting in death, and he brought reason to it, why wouldn't there be a reasonable expectation for him to say something like, whoa, whoa, whoa? Interesting, isn't it? And I submit to you that in this state of mind, that verse 7 and 8, that first of all, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not there. They were not there when this was mentioned, because he was talking about people that they were of lower shelf. He brought all of his officers to this occasion. They were the ones that are like the people that keep the affairs, which is the work of service. They're like the ones, the boots in the streets, if you will, right? They're on the beat. They're like the street cops, right? So they're always out there on the beat, if you will. Whereas everybody else oversees people. That's not what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were doing. They didn't oversee people. They were in charge of the affairs, which is over the service, the work, which means they're out where rubber meets the road, where the sweat and blood and tears are being done, right? They're out where the action's happening. I don't think they're here. I also don't think Daniel's here either. I think Daniel was exempt as the chief of the governors. I don't think he's in the list of the governors. I do not. I think the reason I could say that is because it's inconsistent. If I said he was, his behavior is inconsistent. Then why did he not, like he did with Arioch, why did he not draw from God's relevance of his life, what he's already done in his life, go to reason, resolution, and relying on God? There's no mention of anything that he has to say about the matter if he was there, which I find that to be in no way possible, given what we already saw about him in the previous chapter. Another reason to think he wasn't there are not using those names now. No, Hananiah, no, I'm still using those names. I'm just saying the way they say it in the chapter later on, they're going to call him Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But yeah, I'm saying Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they weren't there. Thank you for catching me on that. I didn't mean to say it like that. So yeah. Right? So they weren't there. I'm saying they weren't there because they were out overseeing the work where rubber meets the road. That's what it means by overseeing the affairs. And as far as Daniel not being there, he said that's the only evidence you have that he would have said something. And the fact that second evidence is he's the chief of the governors, he's not part of the governors. Well, the third evidence would be it's a 6-year time frame that you do not know about in the King James, but you do know about in the Septuagint. 6 years is a long time, my friends, between what just happened in chapter 2 to this. And you can see Nebuchadnezzar responding. He is responding to this image, the interpretation thereof. And look how long it took Nebuchadnezzar, 6 years, the number of man. Man's arrogance took over. He started off here in the image, and right away, worship God, and God of all gods, Lord of all lords, Lord of all kings, right? 6 years goes by, and it starts to fester about how awesome he is, what this image really means. He's the head of gold. You know, in fact, I'm going to build me an image of myself. I'm feeling myself. Yeah. He starts walking on sunshine. He didn't do it right away. But 6 years it took for him just to kind of ruminate over what Daniel had said to him. Which shows you that Daniel also, I'm telling you, Daniel was not interacting with him on a more regular basis. It was intermittent, where he would give accountings of being over this whole province of Babylon. Just like you had in those days when you didn't have Pontius Pilate interacting with the Caesar of his day on a real constant basis. There was touches. They weren't micromanaging. It's more macro management. When you have an empire, look at this. Look at the square miles. 300. This is 300 square miles. Is this right here, right? The kingdom of Babylon. That's 600, right? Another 900. It's the kingdom of Babylon. It's a lot of it. Just from a linear standpoint, it's 900 miles just to the edge of the over this part here. It's about 1,200 miles just going west. And the empire. Do you think that Nebuchadnezzar is going to put the chief of his governors and then say, "Stay next to me"? No. If you had a right-hand man or a right-hand woman, a person who's you're relying on, you don't want them right next to you all the time. You want them to be an extension of you, to help you, to oversee things, right? You could see him easily extending out and overseeing these areas over here and down here. You could see him in this case over the whole region of Babylon. He's extended out from a good 600. He's overseeing a good 900-mile region, not to mention up here. Daniel's got a lot of responsibility. What was Nebuchadnezzar's original intent for these young guys and others? For his army, for a social statues population. What? For a social status population. So Nebuchadnezzar's mindset goes back chapter 1, verses 4, 5, and 6. His attitude was, I'm going to bring nobles and people of wealth, of high station, of officials, and those who are sons of kings that I've conquered, and I'm going to train them up to learn our ways. But I'm going to be selective. From among those groups, I'm going to be selective to choose out people that fit the mold of what I want to be. And that way, he has representations of Assyrians, Hebrews, whoever he's conquered, his representations of those people in his court, so that he can then have the best chance possible. Because remember, he believes in polytheism. He wants to broaden his horizon to get the best, kind of like, best probability of success is to kind of spread out your risk. He's spreading his chances of success by having representations of any kingdom he's conquered. Let me take from their best, from their youth of their best, and school them up so I can get benefited by the gods working in some of them to give me wisdom that I need to lead my country. That's his end game. That's it. That's what he wanted out of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or, of course, as we know them, as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Right? So, and Daniel. That's what he wanted out of those guys. But you see, I think Daniel was not here when this happened. He was not here because he was already doing what he was supposed to have done. It was 6 years going on. It'd be different if he has appointed him, then the story unfolds. Now you're like, oh, wait a second. Okay, he ain't gone nowhere just yet. It just happened. So he there. And that's the problem I always thought. I never could understand it until the Septuagint opens up it opens up your mind like, oh my gosh, there's 6 years that gone by. That explains a lot. Explains a lot. And now you're like, okay, that gives a lot of time for this wasn't a fluid transition. So here we have it again. To the surmise, our time for tonight, we have it again. What happened in chapter 1 happens again in chapter 3. The mistake of Bible students and teachers alike. You read fluidly thinking it just happens one after the other. Chapter 2 is a reflection, an expounding event of what happened at the end of chapter 1, not consecutive. Chapter 1 is like a purview of the first 3 years. Chapter 2 expounds on what happened at the end of the 3 years, what chapter 1 talked about at the very end. Chapter 1, verses 18 to 20, talked about what happened at the very end of the 3 years. Chapter 2 expounded on that, what led up to that. Chapter 3 does a similar thing and says, let's fast forward the tape 6 years, and let's see now what happened to King Nebuchadnezzar now that he lost touch with Daniel because he's out doing what he's supposed to do because the king set him with a large responsibility over the whole province and being the chief of the governors. So he's in charge of the Babylonia area, but he's also in charge of everybody else throughout the entire kingdom, which is pretty massive. That's a massive kingdom he's responsible for. So it would make plenty of sense. If you're the ambassador of the UN, you're going to be more often overseas than you are here, right? Because you represent us to all these countries, right? If that's your responsibility, if you're the responsible party to all these governors, it would make sense that you're constantly traversing throughout the kingdom because you have to do your responsibility wisely, prudently, responsibly, which Daniel definitely is, right? So, yes, I believe that this image is the image. He's rebuilding now the image he saw in his dream. Yes, I do believe that. I believe that's why the image was so terrifying. He was building it because that took him 6 years later, after all this ego he was going through. The initial thought was humbleness and worship to God. But you allow time to come in there. That's what happens, right? When you factor in time, forgetfulness, callousness, our sinful behavior, what happens to us? We become callous, egotistical, arrogant, self-absorbed. Nebuchadnezzar. Don't forget, he's not just any human. He's a king of all kings, of men. I mean, give me a break. Of course it's going to give that guy 6 years without godly influence, without godly counsel. What's going to, I mean, he's here. He had interactions with Daniel. Of course he did. But not on a more constant basis. Not like he just had chapter 2. And that's evidenced by this reality of what he's doing. That's what's happening in chapter 3. It's showing you the lack of ongoing training someone thinks they don't need. Well, once you come to know Jesus, that's all you need. Now, I don't see how you come to know who God is and then fall off the rails. You don't understand that? You just see Nebuchadnezzar, who was moved beyond shadow of a doubt by God's sovereignty, by God's hand, and this young man, 16 years old. How could you ever forget that? Your Arioch, king of your armies, the captain of your armies, was stopped in his tracks. You yourself were stayed from your anger and your frustration to the next morning, and then you're wowed by the wisdom, trustworthiness of God embodied in his person. So much so it moved you to worship him. How can you ever forget that moment? Oh my goodness gracious. Time and lack of time spent. That's how. Because you forget to develop and cultivate that memory, that truth that God gave you. Nebuchadnezzar is an example of us. How we come to know Jesus with, euphoric moment. Oh my God, Jesus died for me. Great, wonderful, altruistic, beautiful, all heartfelt. And then all of a sudden you don't care. You get all consumed with, just raising your hands and saying Jesus loves me, and you know nothing at all about nothing. You don't develop and feed your inner spirit. You don't feed the spiritual understanding. And then 6 years in time is all it took for him to go back off the rails again. You can't tell me if he was in a constant communication with Daniel, he had done the same thing. I don't believe that. I don't believe that. You know how I know that? Because Joseph, it says when a Pharaoh rose up that didn't know Joseph, that's when they went against the people of Hebrews in Egypt. Interesting. So God already showed us before that Joseph, the only other person who interpreted dreams, had a major impact on the Pharaoh. So much so, didn't lay a finger on the people of Israel, nor did they usurp the glory of God. They didn't do that. Not until Pharaoh rose up that didn't know Joseph. Which speaks to, again, the absence of the presence, of the awareness of who God is. You're not feeding into that understanding. You have to work at that. Nebuchadnezzar was not working at that, and you can see the remnants of it peeps up in this area. Right? Yeah. So I think sent to your point, Sister Vicky, it made him afraid. I think it makes the people afraid, going, holy moly, that's supposed to be our king towering over us. That's supposed to bring intimidation and fear, and it really brings them into this, he's ruling with an iron fist is what he wants to rule with. You better fear me. And yet, later on, you're going to find out, of course, he's about 2 chapters away from being told that he's walking as a beast. Then, of course, he gets restored, then he dies, and then his son takes over and so forth. But it's just really interesting, this story. But so far, we're going to end here. We'll pick it up on Sunday and go through more of the story of the fiery furnace. And what you're going to find, again, is that I want to make sure we remind ourselves of this. Daniel was not there when it was built. Neither was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, known as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were not there. They were not there when he was doing this. But in chapter 1, verse 7, then at that time, from that point onward, now is where you start to see Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now they're in view because it's now being instilled that the word's gotten out by now. He's saying, by now, y'all know. Y'all know the rules. No matter where you are in my kingdom, you know the rules. If you're in this region, if you're in this area, you bow down. And they're like, we ain't doing that, right? So we're going to read about that on Sunday. So let's stop there and pray, and we'll get back to that on Sunday about the rest of the story of the fiery furnace. But I just wanted to spend time more reflections from chapter 2. So it's such an important chapter about how to practically apply things to our life that we have to see. We have to see the depth of God's word, the depth of who God is. That's all awesome. But if you don't take also away the practical elements, how to apply it, then it doesn't make any sense. You've got to do that, man. You've got to see Daniel for who he is. Don't love on Daniel. Love on God for loving on Daniel. I love the book of Daniel. I love the book of Revelation. You can love it all you want, but you've got to know what is that vet in your life? Where's the vetting of your own spirit and soul and body? You've got to have that vet you. There's conviction involved in the Holy Spirit, right? That's what his job is. He guides us into all truth. He comforts us. He consoles us. He convicts us. He's going to challenge us to see in our life. Don't grieve him. Let him have his way with you. Like that song, have your own way, Lord. Have your own way. I am the pot. You are the potter. I am the clay. Right? Well, live it. We sing it. Live it. Let him reshape and forge you and crack you. It's going to hurt, but if you want it, it's like the old adage. If you want to get better, you take the medicine. You want to have the bone heal? Let him reset it. It's going to hurt. Let him reset it. let him do it. So with that being said, let's continue to think about that coming into Sunday on the rest of this chapter. So let's pray. So Father, thank you for this time we've had today, looking into your word and understanding of your truth. Thank you for what you do and provide for us. Keep us in your good graces and safe and coming back together again on Sunday. We ask all this in Jesus, Yeshua's name we pray. Amen.